We should be live shortly, right? Okay. Hello, everyone. We have Holly Grace Williams here today. Holly is the technical director for Secarma. So, Holly, tell me, well, I said technical director in short, but what do you do? What's a typical day look like?
The Secarma are a cybersecurity consultancy, but really our core service is penetration testing. So the whole team here are focused on security testing services. The big things at the moment are certainly web applications and mobile application testing, but we do the whole range of security testing services. So that includes the extremes of physical access, breaking into buildings, social engineering, those kinds of things. So a typical day for us is working with an organization to demonstrate business risk through discovered security vulnerabilities, and then working with them to fix those issues that we find. Awesome.
So how do you go about it when a customer asks you, okay, we need the penetration testing done? How do you approach?
I think the big thing when a customer opens with something like that is, what do you mean by penetration testing? There's a lot of marketing buzzwords at the moment. So between vulnerability analysis, penetration testing, red teaming, those kinds of things, it's trying to work out what does the customer actually want the service to look like. The reason for that is, of course, what we do would be a crime if we weren't covered by contract and covered by the authorization form. So it's being really, really clear what kind of service the customer is looking for, and then of course tailoring it to what they want, what the expected output is. So yeah, it starts with what do you want us to break, and what do you expect the output to be, and then we'll build up from there.
And there are different kinds of penetration testing, I believe. So, sorry, I was going to ask, what's the main difference between red teaming and penetration testing? Sorry.
The easiest way to think about it is penetration testing is time limited and scope restricted. So most commonly a company will say, oh, please hack into our website, or please break into our corporate network. And that would be an example of a penetration test. If an organization wants us to come in and just demonstrate business risk, because they say, hey, just hack us as an organization, then that's leaning towards red teaming. So red teaming would have scope unrestricted in terms of being allowed to do physical access, social engineering, and technical attacks. And also it would be unrestricted in terms of we wouldn't necessarily be telling the customer which activity we'd be doing at what time. So a pen tester will test your system security, a red team will test your defensive team.
Absolutely, brilliant. So for some businesses, is there something they should do before they go for a full-blown penetration testing done on their network?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say that the way to have a secure system is just to have penetration testing. From the immature cycle side of things, if you're thinking of new companies, then you should be investigating into vulnerability management. So having internal vulnerability scans done. There's a couple of different reasons for that. One is you can more than likely run those more frequently. And the second is you don't want to be paying expensive pen testers to come in and find, basic hygiene issues, missing patches, those kinds of things. So, do your housekeeping, try and clean things up first before the pen testers get there. And then the second thing to consider is, what would you like the output to be? What is it that you're trying to demonstrate? Are you looking for a really, really realistic attack to simulate a specific threat actor or a specific capability? Or do you just want to see, where are the gaps? Do you want us to come in and use our kind of intuition and our experience?
Absolutely. Do you find some businesses doing penetration testing, getting the penetration testing done as a tick box exercise?
So I think anyone who works in security testing, or probably broader within security, maybe considers compliance to be the devil. And compliance has it does have really important functions, certainly on the hygiene side of things, making sure that the basics are done. And sometimes it can assist companies in making sure that the amount of money that they're spending on security is good. It just depends on what kind of compliance you're building on, and whether or not you understand that compliance does have gaps. So if you're looking at something like PCI DSS, or if you're looking at something like Cyber Essentials, being aware of what isn't this assessing you on. Do some companies just want a pen test as a tick box exercise? Quite frequently, and the way that they'll handle that is scope restrictors. But the report should be accurate to the work that was conducted. So whilst it's frustrating, we try to avoid it.
It does happen. Right. And one last question on this topic. When you go and perform a penetration testing done on a company's network, do you ever find a bad actor already being on the network?
Yeah, this is funny actually. We talked about this on our podcast. It does happen. It's not common, but it is a thing that we have to consider. Certainly for external attacks, web attacks, it's happened to me before, where in that example, file upload vulnerability against a web application, you upload what we call a web shell, which allows you remote access of the server, and you see that there's another web shell there. So there has been another user there. I think if this happens, if you're in the security testing space and this happens to you, the first thing to bear in mind is don't freak out. It could have been another tester. It's not uncommon for companies to have multiple testing teams. In the very least, it's not uncommon for companies to have internal teams and an external provider. And it might just be bad hygiene on the internal testing team or bad hygiene by another pen testing provider. So the thing to do is stop all testing, take good notes on what it was you were up to, contact the customer. Don't immediately freak out and start talking about, business continuity and disaster recovery and those kinds of things, but just explain what it is that you've seen and why you believe that to be malicious in nature. And then if it's necessary, the triage process can take over from there.
Okay, finally, I don't think we answered the question earlier. So what do you do in the company? What's your role?
My role? So from the technical director side of things, that I have two big focuses. The first is the strategy side. So how do I think that testing is going to change in the future, and how can I better prepare this business for that? So what's the next big thing from a business prediction point of view, making sure that we're in a good place? That can be for our service delivery, or it can also be for what a customer is going to need. Pen testing traditionally has been an annual service. You get a pen test once a year. That is no longer effective. So making those changes to how we deliver services to be more effective to the company. And then the second side of things is talking to the community, being engaged with the community, do a lot of public speaking engagements, those kinds of things, either pushing research or just pushing what it is that we find interesting at the moment. We don't do a lot of sales events, but we certainly do a lot of events that are like, hey, this is interesting, you should pay attention to that. So a little bit of research, a little bit of strategy, and I still do testing as well. It's not a big part of what I do, but I like to do at least a degree of testing to keep up to date.
That's good, and I'm a big fan of your podcast, Hacked Off.
Oh, good, thanks.
I've been listening to a lot of them recently.
That was where I came from before I came here. I just came from my recording studio doing an episode.
All right, okay. You mentioned that businesses should do basic cyber hygiene before they go for penetration testing done. So what is that basic hygiene you think?
So there's two big areas that are easy in theory but difficult at scale. The first is patching, making sure things are up to date. It's easy in theory because you just click the update button and you're done. But when you have a lot of systems that are disparate and pushing those updates out can be difficult, knowing what kind of timeline to push updates out can be difficult. So I don't think it appropriate for businesses to have some policy that just says all updates go within 14 days, because some updates are more important than others. Look at any of the out-of-band patches that Microsoft have pushed out. So something like Eternal Blue, those kind of things. Those patches are not necessarily ones you want to delay. So being able to deal with that, good patching hygiene is important but difficult at scale. The second is credential management. I love to live in a world where everyone uses multi-factor authentication, and cracking hashes, cracking passwords, guessing passwords is difficult, but we don't. It's still one of the most common ways that we break into organizations is passwords. And I think the problem with passwords is they're a little bit of a moving target. So you can audit one day and say, okay, none of our staff are using weak passwords, and a staff member can then change their password that day and pick something. And traditionally, the way that we've handled that is through things like minimum password length and complexity. That's the you must have uppercase, lowercase, number, symbols thing. And that's ineffective, because think of passwords like password 1 with a capital P and welcome 2020, summer 2019, those things. Those passwords are often long enough for the minimum password length and match complexity, but they're obviously insecure. So yeah, passwords and patches are the two big things that companies struggle with and should get done ahead of a pen test.
And you are one of the biggest advocates of using password managers?
Yeah, I think this is a really funny thing, because when you get down to it, there's a whole conversation around threat modeling and why do password managers work in what context. And I think sometimes, certainly, I know it from the antivirus research that I did a lot of years ago, people say, well, what do you use? As that must be the correct answer. And my threat model is not your threat model, and the reasons that I do things are not necessarily appropriate to you. I really do like password managers from a usability point of view. If I'm trying to talk to, not very technically aware users, we're not talking about the people in the pen testing team, we're just talking about the average user. Usability versus security improvement, password managers are great. In a lot of instances, we're using hardware-based two-factor authentication because it is more effective than a lot of other solutions. And in fact, in most cases, we use both password managers and MFA. But yeah, from a usability versus security point of view, password managers are great.
What would you tell? Well, this is the back of your podcast again. What would you tell somebody with, you're using the password managers and you're putting all your eggs in one basket? What happens if the password manager is breached?
Okay, so there's two answers to this. There's the answer that people expect me to give, which is the risk is still lower. So if you're making your own passwords up, and if you think of this from the normal staff member's point of view, not an IT member of staff's point of view, if they're making their own passwords and they're trying to remember lots of difficult random passwords, they're going to reuse passwords. They're not going to pick passwords that are great. That's where Welcome 2020, Summer 2019 comes from. So the use of a password manager, even if it has the risk of it being a target for attackers, still improves security because it reduces password reuse and it increases password length and complexity. So still a win. The answer I usually give to that, though, is, what happens when a password manager gets hacked is, well, we know what happens when password managers have been hacked because that's happened before. So a good example would be LastPass in 2015, who got compromised. And I'll give the summary here, but to be honest, take a look online and read the backstory. Don't take my word for it. But in short, password managers encrypt passwords. And if the encryption is good, which generally relies on the master password, that's the one password that you choose to unlock that password manager. If that one's good, then the security is significantly improved and therefore the risk is significantly reduced.
And you would protect that master password again with the two-factor authentication.
Yeah, you can do that. And two-factor authentication can mean different things in different contexts. Certainly here, we absolutely would use multi-factor authentication everywhere. But also things like mobile devices with Face ID, those kinds of things, where you're balancing that security side of things. You can unlock a password manager with Face ID. And a lot of people think of biometrics as a little bit of a risk. Is Face ID a perfect solution? Well, you've also got to consider the fact that you need physical access to the device as well. So there's a little bit more to it than maybe people consider. But yeah, the master password is a weakness that users should be made aware of. So that one should be very good.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to patching again, what would you tell people when we speak to some businesses? They say, oh, no, we don't apply patches straight away. Usually we wait for 10 days, 15 days to see if anybody else is complaining about these patches. Patches are breaking the systems. They're critical servers, even though they are critical patches available.
Yeah, so I get it from their point of view. And whilst a patch or a system update causing a problem is a rare thing, you can quite easily pick up examples. So when the Spectrum meltdown patches came out, for example, there was difficulty there with those patches breaking certain systems. So it does happen. So for companies to be worried about patches causing disruption, I understand it. The problem is when you look at some of the major breaches, so pre-authentication remote code execution vulnerabilities, things like the Pulse server VPN issues that happened, those kinds of vulnerabilities, anything in things like remote desktop gateway, those kind of perimeter breaking vulnerabilities, you just don't have the time. 14 days, 15 days is way, way slower than the real threat actors out there operate. So it's just ineffective. And I think what companies need to do is one of two things. It's either start moving to a tiered patching cycle where they can essentially short circuit that patching cycle if it's something critical. This patch is particularly important and needs to jump through the change management process faster. Or alternatively, look at how you can handle downtime in a better way. Look at the DevOps kind of revolution that we've had recently, where we can handle downtime a lot easier. We're looking at scalability in a different way. We're looking at reliability in a different way, so that if a system does have a problem, it can be quickly replaced. So those kinds of things are an alternative approach. But yeah, just taking, it's 14 days, 15 days for us to install a patch is a very, very bad idea.
What would you recommend? Do you recommend applying patches straight away, or do you recommend test the patches first and then apply them?
Oh, my answer to that will always be a risk-based approach. So that's a bit of a cheat answer to a difficult question, but I think there's a couple of difficulties with testing patches. The first being if it's delaying the patching cycle and the patch is critical, then that's a bad thing. And also, does your testing system accurately reflect your real system? If it doesn't, then that test is probably not going to help anyway. Yeah, testing patches is a good thing if your testing setup is both fast and reflective of your real environment. If it's not, it's probably not helping much anyway. So get those patches out there, at least for the critical issues.
Brilliant. Moving on from there, I have a question for you, which I kind of know your answer. I was listening to the episode this morning when I was running. How much should I, as a business owner or IT manager or security manager, how much should I be investing in cybersecurity?
It's a really difficult question, and I think where it should start is board involvement with security. So the first step should be looking at something like the NCSC's toolkit for board awareness. And if the board can answer all of those questions in the board toolkit easily, you're probably in a good place. If they can't, then that's where that conversation should start. I couldn't give a figure in terms of, 4% of annual revenue or something like that. But definitely the amount of money should be relevant to the risk that your organization faces. So that's a threat modeling thing. Who is likely to target your organization? What are the capabilities of those attackers? And then what is the cost required to mitigate that risk? I think one of the things worth mentioning when it comes down to cost is things like cyber insurance. There's a lot of people in security testing. There's a lot of people in cybersecurity who are flat out against cyber insurance, but it is a thing to investigate as an organization in the very least. If you make the decision not to have insurance or to take insurance as a mitigating factor, do it from an educated point of view. And
not all insurers will pay out.
All insurers will pay out. They're contractually obligated to, but they won't pay out in all instances. And that's the issue, right? It's this was a thing that came up before with the NotPetya breach. NotPetya, a massive piece of malware from the middle of 2017. And that was confidently tied to a nation-state attacker. So people were worried that how does this play with things like cyber insurance? Is this an act of war? Is this an act of a nation-state? Are there caveats on their insurance that don't cover those kinds of things? In the same way that at the moment with, the coronavirus that maybe people are concerned about, is there a pandemic clause in their insurance that reduces any possible payout? And I think the big thing there is that's in part a legal discussion as much as it is an IT discussion. And it's, take a look at the small print, take a look at the terms and see if it's appropriate for you. If you're getting insurance, you need to make sure that it covers everything that you require it to. It's really no different to car insurance. When we buy car insurance, we're aware that there are different levels of service. We have comprehensive right down to third party, and we make a decision based around cost, but also based around the risk to us as individuals, and companies should be doing that. So don't entirely sign off cyber security insurance as a bad thing, but also don't just blindly jump in and say, we need it, it will solve all of our problems.
Absolutely. Who got the insurance paid? Home Depot, did you say? They got their insurance.
I mean, there's been a few cases. There's also been some misinformation around around insurance payouts. You'll hear things like insurers refusing to pay out because it was a nation-state attack and those kinds of things. And actually what happened was it was some other issue with the insurance. There's one instance of a company who didn't actually have cyber insurance but thought they did. But yeah, I know off the top of my head, Home Depot did get paid out from their insurance from their breach, which was a very big one. So it's good for them that they did.
Okay. From there, you mentioned, NotPetya, one of the most popular ransomware attack in the history, almost. We have Merck, and a few other companies. So what's the biggest driver, or what's the biggest reason we are still seeing businesses being victim for, ransomware?
I mean, that's the NotPetya attack is a wonderful thing for talking about ransomware, because there's a lot of people who say it wasn't a ransomware attack. It appeared to be a ransomware attack, but it's a data destruction tool. If the malware could not be decrypted, then that's data destruction, not ransomware. So that's interesting, and especially from the ties back to the nation state links there. But what's the motivation behind ransomware? Possibly for the most part, or certainly what we're seeing is it's financially motivated attackers, right? Ransomware is low effort, high monetization potential. So that's why attackers are interested in it. I do think ransomware is changing at the moment. So certainly when you see groups like SamSam who are taking a more manual approach to ransomware, I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see more of ransomware being tied to data breaches. So things like attackers encrypting data and also stealing some data. I think that'll happen. But yeah, big thing behind ransomware is the ransom part of that word. It's the monetization.
Okay, yes, what you said earlier is right. The NotPetya was not, although it was called ransomware, it was purely there for destruction. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we didn't know that at first though, and that's the big thing. So when it hit and it appeared to be ransomware because it asked for a ransom, you know, companies treated it as such. And the thing there is, for any companies who were thinking, if we get hit by ransomware, we'll just pay the ransom and then we'll be fine. Well, that wouldn't have helped in that case.
So that brings me to ask you, which camp are you in? Pay the ransom, don't pay the ransom?
If you pay the ransom, you are legitimizing that business practice, and you're going to encourage more ransom attacks. They've already been shown to be effective. You also cannot guarantee that you'll get the data back. The NotPetya example is a huge example of that, because really it was a data destruction tool. But even in other instances, if you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee. So that's a huge risk that I couldn't recommend a business to take.
And by paying the ransom, you're also encouraging the crime.
Oh yeah.
And whatever that money is being used for.
Oh yeah, which is possibly more crimes.
Absolutely. Sorry, I lost my question there. I was going to ask you something. I totally lost it. But whenever we go into businesses, right, and talk about, you know, threat out there, they usually say, oh, these, you know, Maersk and Travelex and all these companies are too big, and, you know, we are too small. Nothing will happen to us. What would you say?
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, I hear that where people say, our organization is too small to be impacted, or alternatively, often hear our organization isn't interesting enough. There's the joke I always tell about companies that, oh, we only make envelopes, you know, no one would hack us. And I understand that thought process, but I think it's inherently flawed on 2 points. The first is ransomware. They're aiming to take any money that they can from as many people as possible. So the fact that you're uninteresting, it doesn't matter. You still have revenue, you still pay employees, and they would like to relieve you of that money. And the second is some organizations are hit as collateral damage. You know, if you look again, the NotPetya attack is a good example of this. The understanding is that that was targeted against organizations operating in Ukraine, but it hit more organizations than what it was intended to from that thought process, which means you might just be caught as collateral damage. So taking a stance of no one's ever going to hack us, we're not interesting, no one's ever going to hack us, we're not big enough, it's still high risk.
Absolutely. And how did you get into this? How did you get into cybersecurity in the first place?
So I'll give you my answer in a second, but usually when people ask me that, they say, oh, how do you get into cybersecurity? And they want me to give them guidance. It's like, how can you get into cybersecurity? So I wrote a whole post on the methods that I would say for getting into cybersecurity. There's ethical hacking degrees these days. You can do self-learning for things like the OSCP, demonstrable skills, do CTFs, those kinds of things. Me personally, I'm actually ex-military. So I learned my communications technology skills in the military, and then I converted over to civilian life after a few years.
Is it something you always wanted to do when you were a kid? Or?
Nope, not at all. I think that's the stereotype of certainly not only security testers, but also things like programmers, where people think, oh, you grow up and your whole life you want to be a programmer and those kinds of things. I was also always interested in technology, but I wanted to work on communication systems. The joke is that I wanted to play with satellites and couldn't afford my own, so I used the militaries for a while. And that's, to be honest, quite true. I wanted to work on these big systems that otherwise wouldn't be available to me. And you can understand that working for major organizations, be it military or be it financial sector, be it banking, something like that, security is just such a key concern of theirs that making that move over into security was, you know, not planned, but certainly an obvious move.
What would you say if somebody that I know you said you wrote an article before, and you spoke about it in the past. What would you say if somebody with no technical background, they would like to get into cybersecurity quickly?
It's difficult because cybersecurity is such a huge field. So what do you mean by cybersecurity? You know, do you mean specifically pen testing, which is what I do, or do you mean SOC analyst, or do you mean auditing, GRC roles? I think the first piece of advice,
right?
Yeah, I think the first piece of advice is look at all of those roles and see which one is the most interesting to you, and also bear in mind that you can move between the two as well. You know, you don't have to become a pen tester and then that's it forevermore. Be a pen tester. There's movement between roles, but if you are you know, if you haven't got an ethical hacking degree, if you haven't got a tech background, and you think this is an impossible thing for you to make that move, it's absolutely not. There's a lot of resources online that can help out. People have written books about it. There are conferences about it. Yeah, there's definitely movements you can make. Specifically into my field, if you want to get into pen testing, the best thing to do is to start taking a look at, you know, the day in the life of a pen tester. What is it that we do, and how can you develop those skills? So take a look at the tools that we use. Take a look at the training courses that we run. Of course, there's a financial side to this. You know, there's some very, very good courses out there, like the SANS courses, for example, but they're very expensive. So just take a look at the curriculums, the kind of things that they're offering. If you have enough availability, or if your business will pay for it, then certifications are great. But certainly for our organization, it's not a requirement to get into the field. You do not need a degree. You do not need security certifications. What we care about is practically applicable skills. Can you actually do the job? So any way you can demonstrate that, be it CTFs, be it kind of vulnerable machines, be it just tinkering on your own devices and your own VM labs, any of that's awesome.
But that tinkering always has to be in a controlled lab environment.
I wouldn't say a control lab environment. I'd push that further and say an illegal environment. One of the big things that you should be aware of if you're looking at anything in this space, like I said earlier, our day job would be a crime if we didn't have the contract and the authorization to test form. So become very aware of that. The easy go-to one there, I'm not a lawyer, here's your caveat, but one of the easy things to take a look at is things like the Computer Misuse Act, but also bear in mind that that is not the only act that applies here. There are other laws. The Computer Misuse Act talks about unauthorized access to computers, but there's also things like wiretapping regulation to consider. So yeah, doing things on your own devices that are under your own control is fine, but one of the big things is whatever you do, it needs to be knowingly authorized. So you need to make sure that you've got cover there. There is a stereotype that a lot of pen testers, a lot of security testers come from criminal backgrounds. I can't say that's true because many of them are security cleared, and it wouldn't be possible if they were. It does happen. There are people who move over from the kind of black hat side to the professional side, but it's certainly not everyone. I wouldn't expect it to be a majority in my experience. But yeah, become a little bit familiar with the regulation. Do everything in a safe way. Virtual machines are great, but there are services out there as well that can help. So things like vulnhub.com, Hack the Box, those things. There's a lot of training potential.
Absolutely, absolutely. What you said, there is a misconception that we get this all the time when we organize events. You know, you hack somebody and then hope they will hire you. But
I mean, there are examples that you can look at for that. That they don't work in the way that people think they do. But yeah, if you look at people who have been convicted or threatened with cybercrime charges, certainly in America, there is sometimes, you know, the plea bargain option to become a CI, confidential informant, and start working for the FBI and organizations like that. Doesn't work the same way as it does in Hollywood. It's not a career choice that I would recommend. And given that there are easier ways in, like doing an ethical hacking degree, doing an information security degree, you know, passing certifications in your own time, or even just playing on your own virtual machines, that is a lot better than doing the cybercrimes.
Absolutely. Finally, Holly, how do you see the current situation? How is it impacting your business, the COVID-19?
That was what our podcast was on about this morning. From our point of view, it hasn't been a big impact yet. This organization is set up for remote working, those kinds of things. It's big in the security testing space. If necessary, people can work remotely and those kinds of things. It has impacted some services in terms of on-site work, those kinds of things. There's some discussions around that at the moment. I think for wider businesses, there are not necessarily bigger, but certainly more concerns than some businesses have thought about. So there's the really obvious thing of people saying, oh, if we send everyone to work from home, can everybody get on the VPN? Does everyone have a VPN account? Those kinds of things. And building up from that is, have you actually tested that the VPN can take that bandwidth? Have you actually tested that if every employee works from home, can your VPN take that? What about people who work from home who are in environments where that isn't going to work for them? So, for example, people with housemates, people who live with their partners and don't have space set aside. They don't have like a home office or something like that. You know, if you're living in a studio apartment with your partner, or if you're living in a house share, what is the business security risk impact of things like overheard conversations? Not necessarily eavesdropping, but just having confidential conversations with somebody in the next room, or in a studio apartment, potentially somebody in the same room. And then there's also the considerations around things like, yes, a VPN is one security tool that you can use to reduce risk, but what device are they working on? In what environment are they working? Are they more susceptible to phishing attacks because of the recent events, those kinds of things? So yeah, I think there's a lot more that businesses need to consider than just send everybody home and use the VPN.
I was going to ask that question and you already answered anyway. Holly, thank you very much for your time and sharing the advice.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Give me a second. Let me end the board.